Welcome everyone, another great video. We're looking at the most common financial fears, the most common concerns. We're basing this on some data here, Kevin. We're not just picking them out of a hat. We got a bit of data, specifically a survey that was done in 2023. The results just came out in January of 24. It's from the Ontario Securities Commission and Ipsos. They teamed up. They did a survey. They talked to 1,500 Canadians, all of them over the age of 50. Big chunk retired, another portion not retired. And they got a lot of data out of that survey, Kevin. That's where we're getting these most common financial fears. So we'll go over them, plus pass on a few tips and tricks on how to deal with them. The first one, I don't think you're going to be surprised by this. You do a survey in 2023 and inflation's top of the list.
Yeah, I mean, let's put things in perspective. Right now, prices are higher. Everything's higher. It's going to cost more for rent. Food has gone through the roof. Buying a new car, all these things are much higher. Everybody's worried about, oh my gosh, inflation, it's going to take away everything. Now, again, let's remember this is a 2023 study. Had we done this, say, 2019, before any of this stuff had happened, this may not even be entered there because it's been sort of 40 years before we've seen this inflationary scenario. But that is the most probable thing right now, as we see 62% of pre-retirees are worried about it because they've lived through it now and are worried that's going to be sustainable going forward, and 56% of retirees. So it's over that 50% barrier on both sides. And again, it is because as prices continue to go up, you have to make sure that you have enough money left over to be able to cover these things. And if prices are going up at a very high rate compared to the 2% you've been used to, that can have a real fear factor for anybody going forward and is really something that should be looked at.
Yeah, and a silver lining here. We've had other videos looking at silver linings to inflation. We'll link to those videos. But your CPP, your OAS, those get adjusted upwards. Some of your clawbacks, for example, OAS, that gets adjusted upwards. So some of it does help out when you talk about government pensions and other clawbacks and tax issues. But clearly, after living through the last couple of years, that's number one on the list. Number two, listed by 57% of pre-retirees and 39% of retirees. And whenever I look at data, whenever I look at a list of concerns or financial worries, this is always on the list. So I'm not surprised to see that number two. It's running out of money. And I think this particular survey, the way it was done, I believe it captures a nice little nuance that often we don't see from some of the other data. And that, in my opinion, the nuance is that fear, that worry of running out of money, it eases and it slowly fades as you go through retirement. So it's the highest, in my opinion, the most intense in the pre-retirement phase. The early years of retirement, it's still kind of there. And then as you get through retirement, settle into the routine, it starts to mitigate. And the reason I think that's the case, Kevin, is that pre-retirement, you're doing forecasts. You don't quite know what the budget's going to be like. You're doing forecasts. Then the early years of retirement, you're still trying to settle it and get an idea of how much am I actually spending? What's retirement going to look like? You're figuring out the budget. You keep updating the plan. And then eventually you kind of find the routine. And then when you get to that point, you have a pretty good idea of the budget. You're more confident in the plan. So you're maybe a little less worried about running out of money. That's my opinion. That's why I think this stat shows the pre-retiree number over almost 20% higher. Significant change there. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, basically, as you mentioned, right, the further you get into retirement, the more you know what you're spending, what you're doing, how this works out. Beforehand, you have no clue. It's all a new experience. You go from working person to retired person. Everything else changes in between. So that gives you that. Not only that, but I think some of that factor also deals with what we just mentioned in the previous one, inflation being there. Beforehand, you know, at 2%, maybe I'm a little more comfortable, but you know, I've seen inflation go to 9, maybe it goes back to 2, maybe it goes up to 8. I have to worry about those things as well. But you're right. I mean, the further you get into that sort of scenario, the more comfortable you are. You know what you can do, where you're going to go, how much you're spending on a regular basis, and you know where all your income's coming in from. It's not a bonus here or there that's coming around. So I agree. That's definitely the thing. And make that plan. The mantra we have, make sure you have a plan going forward so you can mitigate some of this fear.
Yeah, I think folks know that's coming. It's always the Becker mantra. It's always there. We'll get to fear number 3 here. And again, this is all from the same data source. This one's really just fear number 1 reiterated as a separate item because an increased housing and rental costs, well, that's related to inflation. And in fact, that's part of how they measure inflation. They look at real estate costs and rental costs as part of that. So in my mind, again, more of a sign of the times. You asked this 3-4 years ago, it's probably much lower on the list. I think this one's kind of number 1, inflation reiterated as a number 3. So you kind of have inflation showing up twice here. On the highest worry list.
Yeah, and then of course, I mean, the costs of housing and everything else are always one that you worry about going up. And of course, they continue for a little while after. But beyond that, I mean, one of the big factors that you start to realize as you get older and older is, well, is my health still maintaining where it was? So, I mean, those unexpected health costs, that may be another reason that we're seeing, you know, where that fear is. okay, I'm fine in pre-retirement. I'm going to last to this long. But what happens if I turn 75 or 80 and all of a sudden I have some big healthcare costs that I have to worry about? As we see beforehand, that's one. But, you're almost equal with retirees that worry about it as well. So even though you're comfortable where you're living, you never know what could come up. And again, with you getting on in age, health does deteriorate somewhat. You don't fight off things as well. So those unexpected healthcare costs, of course, they're never cheap. And that's always a worry for people and a fear going forward.
Yeah, and we do have other videos in this which we'll link to, but there's no magic solution. Ideally, in the pre-retirement phase, you spend some time, you really look into the health benefits, as Kevin mentioned. You try to get a good package. I'll pull this up, looking at the phases of retirement. That yellow circle is what I'm talking about here. And you go through the different phases, maybe 10 years from retirement, and then you get closer and closer. You're 6 months out or 1 year out. You really have to dig into the health benefits, and then you have to make the decision in the early retirement there in the green circle. That's when it's decision time. Hopefully you have a package that meets your needs. Hopefully you have life insurance that meets your needs. In addition to that, ideally, we encourage everyone in all the phases of retirement, all those different colored circles, is you have an emergency fund on hand. So that could help alleviate some of that worry. Lots of folks are probably going to be hearing these worries and they're going to be relating to them. Say, hey, I'm a little worried about that. I've got a question about that. How do they reach out to us, Kevin?
What they do is they go to chatwithclintonandkevin.com, and we'll try to ease all those worries that you have going forward, making sure that you have a financial plan that's set and ready for you. But again, ask any question, whether it's on these spheres or if you've come up with other ones we haven't mentioned in here. We're more than happy to get in touch with you and get back to you really quick and help answer those questions.
Perfect. A few interesting findings here from the survey, from the data. I'll pull this one up because it relates to what we talked about, some of the earlier fears. That 32% of retirees said they found that their typical monthly expenses in retirement were higher than what they had expected before retirement. Now, if 32% thought that, I think it means 68 thought they're more or less in line or lower, which is actually a higher number than I would have thought. That's really positive. But if 32% found that's the case, well, that brings us back to the budget, that brings us back to the worry about running out of money. It's all kind of related to that overall concept. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, basically the budget's a big thing that you have to have. Like, let's remember, there's a lot of people that, if you're living on 100,000 now and you figure, well, but I can live on 35,000 when I retire. That may not be a realistic scenario because, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing this. But yeah, that pre-retirement into early retirement tends to be the area where you haven't forecasted it well. By the time you get to sort of that mid-retirement thing, having that budget really helps out and puts you more in line with what your needs are and can I meet them.
And I pulled the last one up here. Another interesting factor, at least I thought it was interesting when I went through the data, Kevin. The power of attorney, 60% of retirees and 43% of pre-retirees did not have one. That's a bit of a shock.
It is. I mean, you would assume that becomes one of the things as you get close to retirement that you really want to do. But I'm surprised with how many people in retirement don't have it. Let's remember, 6 out of every 10 people based on that survey don't have somebody to look after if something happens to you, given a power of attorney on all your property.
Yeah, and a reminder, if you pass away, your will kicks in. But if something happens to you and you don't pass away and you need some help, that's really when the power of attorney becomes an issue. That's likely the more common outcome, as opposed to just passing away. Is you're still alive but need a bit of help, and that's many folks don't have the power of attorney to help in that situation. And that all kind of leads us to the driving motto here. We've said already is you need to have a plan to help kind of bring all this together, help alleviate some of those fears. Kevin's pointing to it on the screen. It's hard to point to because you don't know where the camera's going to make it go.
I'm looking the opposite way.
But that's certainly the driving force. We will mention we do have a video. We have a specific concern mentioned earlier, number 2, saying I don't want to run out of money. That's a common fear. We have a whole video on that. It's on the screen somewhere. Click on that, and we'll see you again very soon.